He's known as the Oracle of Omaha. Famed investor Warren Buffett is talking with Norah O'Donnell about a new documentary based on a somewhat unlikely friendship.
If there's any story that should be told, it should be her story. If I was a young girl, I'd want to hear that story. It would change my self-image.
Warren Buffett rarely gives interviews, but also rare his friendship with the late trailblazing publisher of the Washington Post. Why did you want to talk about Katharine Graham?
Well, she was one of a kind, and she was terrified of the job. She knew she could do things, but she'd been told all her life that she wasn't, and that females didn't do things. I mean, her mother told her, nobody's interested in listening to you. And so all of a sudden, here she is, and she had an all-male board that was waiting for her, and all they wanted was her to stay home and cash the dividend checks.
Graham was thrust into the role, taking over the company after her husband, Philip Graham, died by suicide. She was then at the center of some of the century's biggest stories.
The much discussed and apparently widely read but still classified Pentagon documents were turned over to Congress today.
She made the decision to publish the Pentagon Papers that helped lead to the end of the Vietnam War.
5 men with bugging gear were found in Democratic headquarters here in the Watergate building.
It was Katharine Graham who supported the investigative journalism that led to President Nixon's resignation after Watergate.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
It was such an extraordinary time.
Oh, everything. And she had been drummed into her head. Only men can succeed at business.
The worst handicap women work under is the self-inflicted one, that if you've grown up thinking of yourself as a second-class citizen, that you tend always to put yourself down.
Graham's journey from housewife to the first female CEO of a Fortune 500 company is laid out in a new documentary, Becoming Katharine Graham, now streaming on Amazon Prime.
I said, Mrs. Graham, you control this company lock, stock, and barrel, but you're still worried about me.
At the center of the story is an unlikely friendship that began on June 4th, 1973. Ah, this is the letter.
That's the famous letter.
The famous letter. When Buffett sent Graham a letter after buying a significant amount of the Washington Post company's stock.
I said, I'll never buy another share unless you personally okay it. And I signed a document, and we became friends.
He used to come to board meetings with about 20 annual reports, and he would take me through these annual reports. I mean, it was like going to business school with Warren Buffett.
Why did you invest in the Washington Post in the first place?
Well, it was ridiculously cheap.
You saw a bargain.
Oh, it was a super bargain. It was worth at least $500 million and was selling for $100 million.
She was beyond lucky. Thank God our stock got so cheap that it attracted Warren's attention in 1973.
Don Graham is Katharine's son and a former publisher of the Post. Don Graham says that Warren Buffett is the greatest thing in business that ever happened to Katharine Graham.
She needed somebody to reassure her.
What were the things you would say to her to boost her confidence?
The biggest thing I said is, I said, when you look in the mirror, you know, it's a funhouse mirror because you're seeing it through the eyes of what the males are telling you about it. So my job is to turn that funhouse mirror into a regular mirror. And she knew I was on her side. And I admired her enormously, and she was torturing herself. She couldn't help doing that.
Nixon hated the Post and us personally for his dying day.
The documentary, for the first time, shows the public the full extent of President Richard Nixon's feud with Katharine Graham.
I saw her on the TV last night, Mrs. Graham. I would have thought she's about 85 years old.
Yeah.
She's only about, I think, something like 57.
Oh, no, I know that.
She's aged terribly.
She's a terrible old bag.
Oh, she's an old bitch in my estimation.
That's right.
Did she talk about facing that kind of sexism and those kind of taunts from even the President of the United States?
Well, Nixon didn't scare her at all.
What did scare her was the idea of losing the paper.
The Washington Post, its press is crippled in a violent strike by...
Never did that feel more real to Graham than in 1975, when the Post's printers damaged the presses and went on a bitter strike for more than 4 months, limiting the paper's circulation. How challenging was that?
Well, that tore her apart. She was suffering in that way at that time more than she ever suffered during Watergate or during the Pentagon Papers or anything, but she thought she might be blowing everything.
Buffett told us Katharine Graham prevailed because she was brave. And it's because of her that the Washington Post company's stock price went up more than 3,000% while she was publisher. But she didn't just make Buffett a lot of money.
She said, "My effect on Warren has mostly been limited to his lifestyle. I introduced him to the possibility that a steady diet of fast food and cherry Cokes might not be the best for him."
Yeah, but she didn't convert me.
So your favorite foods are?
Whatever I was eating when I was 6.
Which was?
It was hot dogs and hamburgers and Coke and ice cream sundaes. Root beer floats are my favorite. I frequently have a dinner of a root beer float.
And so you're at Katharine Graham's house at this fancy, her very
fancy.
fancy.
Yeah, and she's got a chef and a French.
Her French chef, and you get served a lobster. And what did you do with the lobster?
Well, I unfortunately attacked it from the wrong side. and finally, and of course, she was very reluctant to criticize me. Finally, at some point, she said, it might be helpful or something. And what did I know about lobsters?
Graham died in 2001, and Buffett served as an usher at her funeral.
That's a good picture.
As for the Oracle of Omaha, the legendary investor is now 94 years old, still chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, and still making front-page news. Every word he utters has the power to roil the financial markets.
Can I just ask you a couple of questions about kind of how you see the state of the economy right now?
Well, I think that's the most interesting subject in the world, but I can't talk about it now. I really can't.
How do you think tariffs will affect the economy?
I mean, tariffs are actually, we've had a lot of experience with them. They're an act of war to some degree.
How do you think tariffs will impact inflation?
Over time, they're a tax on goods. I mean, the tooth fairy doesn't pay them. I mean, and you always have to just, and then what? You always have to ask that question in economics. Always say, and then what?
So is there an answer for that when people say, inflation persists, consumer prices keep going up, when's the end in sight?
No, prices will be higher 10 years from now and 20 years from now and 30 years from now.
And what do you think about what's happening in Washington right now? About efforts to
I think
cut
it's Washington.
Yeah.
It's, technology changes things, all kinds of things, but Washington is Washington. And the problem with politics is that you tend to have to make tiny compromises as you go along.
And what do you think about Elon Musk's efforts to cut?
Well, I better not get into that. Oh,
do you talk to him at all?
I've talked to Elon a few times.
And any thoughts about his current efforts in Washington? No. No. You've always been bullish on American companies.
Majority of any money I manage will always be in the United States.
And why is that?
It's the best place. I was lucky to be born here.